In the woodcut entitled Metamorphosis, the birds, bees and fish that emerge from the background suddenly give way to a view of a southern Italian town, precise in every detail. Maurits Escher lived in Italy for 13 years. It was undoubtedly the happiest period of his life. He met his wife, 2 of his 3 sons were born there, and he produced almost half of his woodcuts and lithographs in Italy. If he ever needed a landscape, street or building for one of his later prints, he pulled out one of his sketches from this period. In this way he was able to make use of his unremitting nostalgia for his Italian years. The Dutch city of Haarlem in 1920. A slight figure reflected in a chandelier of the city's cathedral church writes to a friend about what he feels when he listens to the organ. Suddenly a gale rushed through the pipes of the organ, and a thundering voice proclaimed the glory of God. Then the young man lay down on his back on the cold stones, the large cold stones, while the hurricane blew and the voice thundered. The columns of the church could bear the sound no more than he could. They stretched as a person stretches when waking up, so much so that they seemed about to break. And the young man lay on his back on the cold stones of the church and stretched out his arms as if to be crucified. And above him he saw the swaying and undulating columns. The organ grew much larger, the pipes reached from the earth to the heavens, and the young man felt such a strong wind that he rose up from the stones and flew into the sky, between the swaying columns. Mauk Escher, the young man blown out of the church by Bach, has just moved to Haarlem. He often goes to listen to the church organ, as this is the best way to get rid of a bad mood, a somber mood. He often has such moods. He lives in lodgings, alone, far away from the city of Arnhem where he spent his youth. He's far away from his friends to whom he writes long letters, and far away from the girl he's in love with whom he also corresponds. Her portrait hangs on his bedroom wall. He suspects, though, that his love is unrequited. Yesterday, in a sentimental mood, I picked up my cello, Mauk writes to her. There was a thick layer of dust on it, and I kept my housemates awake until 2:30 with my melancholy lamentations, all on 2 strings because the G and the C have long since snapped. I was lit eerily by the skull in which I've placed an electric light. After all, what is man? After a vain attempt to pass his high school exams, Mauk Escher's worried parents sent him to Haarlem. They see it as one of the few possibilities left to equip their son for society by having him learn a proper craft. He attends a school that teaches everything, from working with enamel to designing houses.
Ik ben naar de school voor bouwkunde en sierende kunsten in Haarlem gegaan met het idee om daar architectuur te studeren. Dat was omdat mijn ouders waarschijnlijk dachten, die jongen die moet dan maar eens proberen of die dat kan. En daar kwam ik onder handen van mijn leraar Jessehoen de Mesquita, die zelf een hele bekende graficus was. En die heeft gezien de linoleumsneden die ik als leerling van de burgerschool heb gemaakt. En die zag daar blijkbaar wat in. En die zei, toen zou je eigenlijk niet in plaats van die architectuur te gaan studeren, liever doorgaan als graficus. En dat wou ik maar al te graag. Dat vond ik natuurlijk veel leuker. Die architectuur heeft me eigenlijk nooit iets gezegd. En mijn vader heeft toen schoorvoetend gezegd, nou ja, vooruit, dat moet dan maar, hè.
One of Escher's woodcuts from his Haarlem period is called Never Think Before You Begin. A lonely figure carrying a dim lantern advances cautiously along a dangerous mountain path. It's a perfect analogy of his decision to make a living as a graphic artist. It took more than 30 years for him to earn enough from his work to live on. Luckily, he had rich parents who didn't mind regularly helping him out financially. Mauck grew up in a well-off family that lived in an enormous house with lots of servants. In his boyhood room were photographs of paintings he'd seen on holiday trips abroad with his parents, mainly Flemish primitives, because he only thought a painting was really interesting if it dated from before the Renaissance.
Op de burgerschool in Arnhem, waar ik was, daar was de tekenles voor mij ver weg het prettigste van alles. Ik vond die school afschuwelijk. Behalve de tekenles, dat was een soort van verademing. Maar dat wil niet zeggen dat ik een uitzonderlijk goede tekenleerling was. Ik kon het wel betrekkelijk goed, maar helemaal niet uitzonderlijk. Ik geloof dat ik op mijn eindexamen een 7 heb gehaald.
Now he sits in his room in Haarlem, drawing day in, day out in every imaginable style. There are assignments from his teachers as well as his own ideas going through his mind and often leading him to desperation. A whole load of junk is shooting around in my head, upside down, he notes when struggling yet again with a drawing. He chooses the subject Dance of Death for a talk he has to give at school. Dance of death and life are two expressions with the same meaning, he tells his fellow pupils in a 3-hour lecture. What else do we do other than dance death into our souls? But even more interesting than his Weltschmerz is perhaps what Escher says about making woodcuts. Someone like Holbein made such a powerful and intense series of prints precisely because he had to restrict himself to black and white, and precisely because cutting a picture into wood is such a difficult process. A graphic artist is in a better position to express an idea clearly and purely, and is less inclined than a painter to be tempted to produce something with a hollow effect. Using as few means as possible to express an idea as clearly as possible is an ideal he would always cherish. Just how expressing an idea or telling a story preoccupies him can be read in a letter to one of his friends in Arnhem. When I walked home on Saturday night, he writes, I suddenly saw a wonderful row of trees in the moonlight that I'd never noticed before. I had an incredible urge to make something of it, and that's what I'm doing now. But I'm a bit afraid of the proverbial storm in a teacup, because I've often had these impulses. A few days later, he adds, a stately row of trees that stroll over the distant hills, and suddenly, after climbing the last hill, stand in front of us, enormous and threatening. Isn't that a wonderful idea? That's the essence, but it's never as intense as I feel it. I console myself with the thought that a man can never express a feeling in an image as intensely as he feels it himself. I will show it to de Mesquita tomorrow. In 1922, Mauck completes his studies at the School of Decorative Arts and Architecture. Maurits Escher is a good graphic artist, writes the headmaster in his final report, but he lacks the right artistic temperament. His work is too cerebral. neither emotional nor lyrical enough. Not a cheerful conclusion to go out into the world with, especially if you've just heard from your true love that she's not interested in you. Like all romantics, though, Escher fortunately knows where paradise can be found. Italy. He'd been there with his parents on holiday and was deeply impressed by its natural beauty. I should have to stay here for months to understand the passionate rolling hills and rich vegetation, he wrote to his friends. And on the towns and their extravagant palazzos and churches, mosaics and frescoes, I'm indulging so greedily that I fear that my stomach cannot take it. At the end of 1922, strolling through the streets of Siena, he feels that he belongs in Italy. If a man's happiness depended on the place he lives in, I would stay in Siena for the rest of my life, he acknowledges. I pity you northerners. And because he's afraid that his mind will not be able to cope with the new atmosphere he now lives in, the unexpected surprises and unrivaled moods that this blessed place present him with every day, he draws, makes woodcuts, and writes one letter after the other. His struggle to express ideas in his woodcuts has been forgotten. For the next 13 years, he mainly feels called upon to record what he sees around him, and for a time to wrest it from oblivion. He wrestles with little human weaknesses. And there are, of course, times when he is lonely. Wouldn't it be great if we could talk together again, he tells a friend, about everyday things, about Arnhem and Haarlem, about the issue of sex, about life, and about life with a capital L, about ruin and damnation, Landru, Dadaism, and so on. But in general, he's happier than ever. From the holiday resort of Ravello on the Italian south coast, he writes a few months later, "I'm working hard, and that is the main reason for my happiness, because gentle nature, the warm spring and good lodgings would certainly not be enough to make me happy. I've left my woodcutting behind in Siena. My drawings serve only as a diary, so that I can look back later and see what I saw here, and see better what I see." He sometimes becomes so enthusiastic that he starts singing out loud to the flowers he's drawing. And in the hotel guest book, he declares that Dutch blood flows only sporadically through his veins, due to all kinds of foreign influences. Apparently he felt a different person, and underlined the fact by letting his beard grow, and solemnly noting it down in his diary. On the memorable day he decides to stop shaving, a Swiss girl and her parents arrive in the hotel. At the table on which my paper lies, Maurits informs his friend in Arnhem, is a 25-year-old girl. She's eating a biscuit at the moment, and this moves me deeply, because it is hot and she's wearing a sleeveless blouse. Girls' arms always move me profoundly, not when they're fat and red, but when they're on the thin side, and young and innocent and burnt a little by the sun. He resolves not to pursue this girl, who so moves him, because he knows from experience how unpleasant unrequited love is. Nevertheless, this love turns out to be mutual, and soon Mauque is composing a poem in French about Jetta's hands. Hands, he says, are the most honest part of the human body. They cannot lie as laughing eyes and the mouth can. When the Umica family returns home, they continue to write to one another. As yet, there appears to be no great intimacy. It takes Escher 4 attempts before he's able to bring himself to write, "Dear Jetta." But after a year, their increasingly frequent and ever more passionate correspondence leads to marriage. The couple move to Rome. As if to record their happiness, Escher makes a series of woodcuts about the creation, ending with an idyllic Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Escher hardly ever made portraits. He didn't feel comfortable when someone posed for him. But of course, that didn't apply to Jetta. Their house in Rome is enlivened by a silk wall hanging Escher printed himself. Golden white and black dogs fitting artfully together like a puzzle. It's an amusing game that he sometimes indulges in after his Haarlem period. But they are isolated experiments. For his real work, he's devoted to doing Italian landscapes. Each year, he takes long hikes to look for subjects for his woodcuts, preferably in the most inhospitable of places. "I'm so sorry we can't go on a spring hike together," he writes to one of his friends from his youth. "It's become my custom to go on a hike every spring, refreshing my spirit and body and providing inspiration for the months ahead." "I know of no greater joy than wandering through the valleys and hills, from village to village, taking in unbridled nature and enjoying the unexpected and inconceivable, which is in the greatest imaginable contrast to day-to-day life at home." The most unpleasant things, a bed riddled with bugs, food often of inferior quality, that appears to be not only one of the conditions, but rather a part of the pleasure. In Rome, Jetta and Mauk lead a carefree life, unencumbered by the pressures of social status and high society. A print like the Tower of Babel seems to be made mainly in order to look down, bemused from a great height, on the human commotion below. I wish to hold no position, and nor shall I ever hold one, Escher writes challengingly to one of his successful friends. I simply wish for a shop, probably a sweet shop. My mother will then be able to answer the questions put to her. One son is a professor at the University of Leiden, and the other has a sweet shop in Rome. And I hope on telling this, her heart will swell with pride. But Escher's father, who sends his son a monthly allowance, notes in his diary that the children of a carpenter have all found their own way in the world. Something to be envious of, he adds. And his concern only grows when the couple have a son. Mauk writes with delight and amazement in his letter, "He's an adorable, sweet and beautiful child, certainly no misfit." After a while, his lack of income starts to worry even Escher himself. Now and then a successful commercial venture brings a little relief. Wrapping paper, for example. Later in his life, postage stamps, wood panels, murals and tablecloths will follow. When his son is a little bigger, he reads to him. And on a couple of occasions, it even leads to a new print. His main source of inspiration, however, remains Italy.
Wat sprak u bijzonder aan in het Italiaanse landschap?
Ja, dat is moeilijk te vertellen. Het Zuid-Italiaanse landschap interesseerde mij hoofdzakelijk. Niet zozeer het Italiaanse landschap in het algemeen, maar de Moorse invloeden, die broodjesdaken bijvoorbeeld, samen met rotspartijen was dat boeiend. Waarom? Ja, dat weet ik niet. Het heeft niks met renaissance te maken of met barok. Ik heb in Rome gewoond, 12 jaar. En de architectuur van Rome op zichzelf heeft me nooit eigenlijk veel gezegd. Omdat die veel te renaissancistisch en te barok was.
"Don't you do too much of the same thing?" he was asked in an interview at the time. "Perhaps I do," he answered, "but if something moves me, I have to draw it. I may sell little, but I cannot sit still. I've been to places where few strangers, if any, have ever been." One of these places is Ganges, where a number of jeering street boys coax him into entering the crypt of the San Nicholas Church. In the niches set in a wall are about 100 mummified bodies of priests, and while the boys throw the hats of the priests at one another, Escher sketches the remains of what were once people. In the final lithograph, he leaves out the life story of the priests, written in sonnet form and hung in a frame above their heads. Instead, there are the words, "Ite missa est," the last sentence of every Mass. The rest is silence. In Rome, one of his old Harlem themes returns. Escher and his surroundings mirrored in a reflecting ball. In 1959, he writes about this lithograph and about himself. The head of the graphic artist, or to be more specific, the point between his eyes is at the center. Whichever way he turns, he remains the middle point. Man's ego is uncompromisingly the center of the world. Escher is often so involved in his work that Jetta and the children have to eat without him, listening to the noise that penetrates from his studio, the drumming of his nails on the workbench, the whistling of a Bach melody. The city he lives in, Rome, has never inspired Escher. But when its imposing buildings are spectacularly lit up by floodlights at night, this changes. "Last night," he writes to a friend in the Netherlands, "I made sketches of that amazing and splendid nocturnal Rome, whose architecture I love much more than during the daytime. If we ever go to Rome together, I'll show you around the Rome I love. Then we'll walk in this fantastic scenery, cleared of people, as if in a wonderful dream." But this fantastic scenery was lit by the fascist regime for the specific purpose of filling it with crowds. Escher, who once said he didn't want to become an Italian among Italians, that he would be satisfied to remain a stranger, was no longer able to detach himself from Italian reality. His eldest son has to join in marches wearing a fascist uniform. It was time, after 13 years, to leave Italy. After the family moves to Switzerland, Escher looks around him and his heart sinks. In the winter of 35-36, he writes later, "We were in the Swiss mountains, in that awful white snowy misery. I hate that white shroud that covers the earth." His sons were having a wonderful time, but where was he to get his inspiration in heaven's name? For the first time, disheartened, he copies someone else's work. Perhaps it was no accident that it was Jeroen Boss's vision of hell. Or he lay awake at night, trying to imagine how he could portray Bach's music graphically. He makes one lithograph of his immediate surroundings. When it's finished, he takes a good look at it and is shocked by the pathetic result. If that's the best he can do, he might as well give up. One evening, lying awake in bed, he hears a swishing, rustling sound. It's Jetta plaiting her hair. It reminds him of the sound a boat makes as it cuts through a calm sea. He's overcome by a great longing. Sailing on a calm sea, on the forward deck of a ship, towards a horizon that continually recedes, waking up in a cabin and feeling that you're not lying flat and still, but rocking gently. These were the experiences on his first sea journey in 1922 that he now yearns to relive. In exchange for some prints, he and Jetta are allowed to sail on Italian freighters. Now and then, they go ashore. For example, in desolate Spain, where 2 months later civil war is to break out. A boat journey like this is an oasis of peace, he writes, shocked after returning to the ship. Europeans are destined slowly but surely to sink into the morass. All their attempts to save themselves are fruitless. They sink deeper and deeper. Wherever you cast your eye in the world, there is nothing but inconsolable misery, and the threat of war, bankruptcy and revolution is increasing everywhere. Hope for a better future doesn't exist for the objective and impartial onlooker. But it's precisely in that depressing Spain that he finds a source of inspiration that can replace the Italian landscape, that would induce him, the man who'd had so much trouble drawing things he didn't have in front of him, to draw the non-existent worlds that would make him famous. It was in Spain, as he later says, that his eyes were opened. For days on end, Jetta and Maurits are busy, feverishly copying the geometric motifs of the Arabs in the Alhambra. The great intricacy and geometric artistry of the patterns had already been noted by Escher in a visit long before, but now he obviously sees more in them. The patterns make an impression on him of something ancient and eternal. Each pattern repeats itself endlessly in a kind of two-dimensional universe. But if such a pattern is a universe, Escher wants to populate it with figures drawn from reality. All that's wonderful, incomprehensible, splendid, enchanting surrounding us in the world depends on repetition and multiplication, he writes later in a booklet about his theory of regular plane division. We're not deaf, blind or dumb. We're conscious of the shapes that surround us. And they only have meaning if we recognize them as clear symbols of people, animals, things we see around us. Capricious patches of abstract geometric figures hold little meaning for us. Coming home, he tries to transform the Arab geometric figures into people, seahorses, birds. He shows his attempts to his brother, a geology professor, who advises him to read some articles by crystallographers. They're involved in the same things as you are. It's a revelation. These are people who systematically study the kinds of patterns that intrigue Escher so much. From that moment on, he spends year after year filling in one school exercise book after another, designing his own theory of regular plane division. Up until his death, he uses his system to arrange an amazing quantity of fish, frogs, birds and lizards in mosaics. It shows how fascinated he was by this game with different figures that you can never actually see at the same time, because one is the background for the other. His studies in plane division are not meant for the general public. They only occasionally surface in his official prints. The first one is development, quickly followed by day and night. Later, it becomes one of his best-selling prints. In 1938, this couldn't have been predicted. Friends and acquaintances to whom he shows his new work find it peculiar and don't really know what to make of it. Disappointing, especially since he's spent a whole year experimenting and exploring this new direction in his work. Fortunately, his old teacher, de Mesquita, is enthusiastic. Escher, who has moved from Switzerland to Brussels, regularly visits him. But he doesn't really need any encouragement. Once, his ideal was to master his trade completely. He sometimes chose subjects because they lent themselves particularly to a certain technique he wanted to try out. Now his ideas excite him so much that he wants to explain them to others at all costs, ideas that can only be expressed in images rather than in words, such as the play of figures that are each other's background. The optimist and the pessimist can never be seen at the same time as long as they are figures in a regularly divided plane. You can see either one or the other. But when they emerge from the flat surface, we see a black man and a white man shaking each other's hand. Escher throws himself into his work more passionately than ever. I cannot imagine what my life would have been like if I'd not been confronted with the question of plane division, he later writes to an admirer. I am, so to speak, head over heels in love, and I still don't know why. The more fanatically he's absorbed by his work, the sadder and lonelier Jeter feels. And when the family moves to the quiet Dutch town of Baarn at the beginning of the Second World War, the situation only gets worse. He notes her symptoms in his diary with concern, but doesn't realize that her isolation could be one of the causes. Deep down, she's been jealous since that time, he remembers later. It's the one-sided perspective of someone whose work is more important than anything else. Nevertheless, Escher is not indifferent to things happening around him. He has difficulty concentrating on his graphic work and keeps busy carving a large wooden ball on which angels and devils literally grow out of each other's background. Since the exclusion of Jews, I always have an unpleasant feeling when I exhibit my work, he writes to a friend. A feeling that I'm a kind of profiteer. I would much rather stop exhibiting. Indeed, he does stop, does not become a member of the Nazis' Department of Culture, and withdraws his membership of the Association of Graphic Artists. He regularly visits his old Jewish teacher, de Mesquita, sometimes taking a small gift. One afternoon, when he arrives at the door, de Mesquita and his wife and son have been taken away. He collects the prints spread haphazardly throughout the house. One of them, trampled by the hobnailed boots of a soldier, he carefully keeps for the rest of his life. In the final year of the war, Escher no longer gets around to work. A woodcut takes more effort than ever. My brain seems completely numbed, he writes to a friend. But he expresses his astonishment to the same friend just after the war that all of a sudden there is demand for his work. I cannot tell you how encouraging it is that I've been able to make a living from my work for the last 2 months. It's the first time in my life this has happened. Almost 10 years pass before that happens again. By making all those prints with figures stepping out of a flat surface into the world, Escher apparently becomes aware of what a strange phenomenon it is, a three-dimensional drawing. He'd always had a preference for unusual, often high perspectives, and for reflective balls with distortion. But now his astonishment in the reproduction of perspective becomes a separate theme. Isn't it absurd to draw a few lines and then call it a house? He wonders. And he distorts the spatial illusion by suggesting a strange bump in the paper, which of course is also an illusion. Or he combines various perspectives in one drawing. It's a productive period, with a high output, in which he also finds time to experiment with a new technique. The mezzo tint is a laborious procedure, which makes velvety dark grey and black tints possible. But after 3 years of experimenting, he gives it up again, because, he says, it takes too much time and effort from someone who, rightfully or wrongly, believes he has no time to waste. The fear of wasting time urges him back to the discipline of his studio every day after a 2-hour walk in the woods. This gives him the peace of mind he needs to be able to think about new work. And for the first time since Italy, he sees things around him that appear to be worth using in a print. It's not the romantic picture of the woods that intrigues Escher, but rather the distortion of perspective by a ripple, or the possibility of naturally incorporating more than one perspective in a print. He can no longer complain about lack of attention. Time and Life magazine devote long articles to him, and an exhibition of his work is organized in Amsterdam's Stedelijk Museum for an international conference of mathematicians. He also gives a lecture. After that, he keeps in touch with a number of scientists. Over the years, some of them make suggestions for prints, such as for concave and convex, where shapes and lines are used that appear on the one hand to emerge and can on the other actually be seen as depth. These contacts with scientists lead to many misunderstandings later on. "I'm not a teacher of mathematics," he writes somewhere, annoyed. "I just want to cause a stir." And he tries to do that in a way that doesn't require long-winded explanation. "Can you imagine," he writes in the same letter, "that I spent more than a month thinking about a print like concave and convex because everything I conceived was so difficult to grasp?" Escher is amazed by the world around him and tries to discover exactly what he sees and why. In his view, that's the only similarity between him and various scientists. Jetta is not well. When she's admitted to a sanatorium, Escher writes helplessly, "I'm a graphic artist, and apparently that's all I am, because I can't help Jetta." About the lithograph Bond, in which we can recognize Jetta and Maurits, he writes, "Like an endless bond, even their foreheads woven together, they form an inseparable entity." But he also writes, "Whether these two are glad to be bound so firmly together, I cannot tell. It's a perilous undertaking, and they look a little sad."
Door uw hele werk komt ook steeds een enorme belangstelling naar voren voor geometrische vormen.
Ja.
Waarom? Waarom juist die vorm?
Ja, wat wilt u nou? Waarom? Dat kun je niet zeggen. Het is zoals het is. Die belangstelling die bestaat er nou eenmaal voor de wetmatigheid. De wetmatigheid in de natuur kun je wel dat noemen. Hè? Een kubus is op zichzelf een wonderlijk fraai ding. En je kunt hem een beetje ingewikkelder maken. Je kunt ingewikkelder figuren maken. Octaeders en tetraeders en zo. Die zijn allemaal boeiend op zichzelf. En als je zo'n ding in je handen neemt en ronddraait, dan ben je getroffen door de schoonheid en door de zeer grote regelmaat van dat ding. En dan overvalt je een zeker gevoel van ongelukkigheid en van... je weet zelf niet wat je ermee moet beginnen. Je zou zo graag er wat van mee willen doen, maar het is er al. Eigenlijk is het genoeg om zo'n ding in papier te maken en ernaar te kijken. Maar als je nou eenmaal graficus bent en je wil er een prent van maken, dan denk je bijvoorbeeld, aangezien deze regelmaat zo groot is, laten we daar als contrast omheen zetten een soort van chaos. Laten we er een prent van maken die de tegenstelling illustreert van orde en chaos. En dat heb ik dan ook gedaan. Daaromheen zijn allerlei kapotte en verfrommelde figuren, stukken die ik indertijd, het was in de winter, ben gaan zoeken op de mestvaalt en zeer zorgvuldig heb samengeraapt chaotische voorwerpen waarvan je nog net kon herkennen wat ze betekenen. Want dat is helemaal niet zo makkelijk. Het is eigenlijk makkelijker om de regelmaat uit te beelden dan de chaos. Als je bijvoorbeeld zegt, die chaos wil ik nog meer uitbeelden. Ik wil bijvoorbeeld nemen een stuk modder. Ja, dat kun je aan een beschouwer niet duidelijk maken dat het een stuk modder is. Dergelijke dingen zijn alleen aardig wanneer je ze nog herkent.
Escher gains new admirers. In prints like Waterfall, in which an amazed Escher shows the absurdities that can be put on paper with perspective, they find a kindred spirit. They too experiment with perception. You can see that Escher smokes pot, someone writes. But Escher is not much impressed by the 60s generation. The Beatles and many other recent Beatle-like phenomena, he writes to his son who has emigrated, are disturbing. There is something wildly revolutionary in the air. Your children may see a lot of changes, and then it will be a good thing that they live in the expanse of a sparsely populated country such as Canada. Because, mark my words, this is only the beginning of a world that is going to free itself from old taboos. The man that once said, "I try in my prints to convince people that we live in a clean, orderly world and not in an unregulated chaos," now writes to a friend, "It's a pity that the world we live in is such a hopeless case. It's an unfathomable, wild, dangerous world, an irrational gamble. I myself prefer to live amongst abstractions that have nothing to do with reality." He's convinced that no one will understand his series Circle Limits that he's so enthusiastic about. It's the eternity of the universe captured in a circle. The figures multiply endlessly, but never reach the edge of the circle. He enjoys his work just as much as he used to, but he is tortured by fears he never had before. A disease makes everything he does more and more difficult. And he and Jetta become estranged for good. What do you do with someone who is bored? She should just pull herself together, damn it, he writes. And she complains to an acquaintance, always that black and white. I can't take it anymore. Finally, she leaves. Going to a son in Switzerland, where she comes back to life a little. The last images we have of Escher are not gloomy. We see an old man in his studio, doing the things he enjoys, complaining about everyone who nags him to make reprints of old work. But in fact, he's proud of his success and gives lectures on his work. On the door of his materials cupboard, there are a photograph of his old teacher, de Mesquita, and of the South Italian coast, where the sun always shone.